everybody, welcome to my channel. If you are a returning viewer, you may have noticed that I have a new channel name. The more I thought about my old channel name, the less I liked it. It's difficult to tell people about since nobody understands what it was called, so I have changed my name to Electro Zoomer. There's many reasons for that, partially because Electro Boom is a channel that personally inspires me. And then, obviously the next thing is Electro Zoom. However, that channel name is taken by a stupid DIY channel. So I settled on the channel name Electro Zoomer because I am personally a zoomer, and I just think it's a little catchier and it sounds nice. So that's what we're going to be going with for now. It's also a little bit applicable to the Sur Ron. So that's the reasoning for that. I hope you all like that channel name. And I just want to say thank you to for all of the support that I've gotten so far. I've been honestly blown away with how many views and likes and kind comments I've gotten thus far. So I'm totally thrilled with that. As you know, if you've been watching this channel at all, I have very low production value. I'm just kind of throwing videos out there in hopes that it'll help somebody out. So I really appreciate all of the support that I've gotten thus far. I honestly didn't think I would get this much support within a week of making my channel, but here I am. So today we are going to be talking about the Sur Ron in water and snowy environments. This really applies to any electric bike, but since the only electric bike I have experience with is the Sur Ron, we're going to be talking about that specifically and sort of the waterproofing measures that have been taken on the stock bike and further waterproofing measures that you can take personally. So a lot of people, when they think of electric bikes, they would think that that's not compatible with riding in wet environments at all. However, I've had a very different experience through my time riding the Sur Ron. Last summer was a very rainy summer where I live, and so I really got to give it a good real-world test in wet environments, and so far I've been very impressed. So let's hop right into it. Oh, before we hop right into it, actually, I would like to say, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and then comment as many times as you possibly can. All of that would be much appreciated. All right, now we're getting into it. So, electricity and water. Everybody knows that electricity and water do not mix. However, I want to explain a little bit of why that is the case. So, here in this picture you can see this is a water damaged circuit board. This is pretty typical of what you're going to see on any circuit board that's been exposed to water. You're going to see mineral deposits, which is the sort of white crusty looking stuff around here, pointed to by the green arrow. And you're also going to get corrosion, which is the brown, pointed to by the blue arrow. So both of those are very much not good for your electronics. Another thing, which is the root of all of these problems, is short circuits here, as demonstrated by the red arrow. So water on its own, the simple molecule H2O, that molecule is not conductive on its own. So pretty much the only way you're going to get pure H2O is if you have distilled water. Even that's not pure H2O, but for all intents and purposes, we will consider that pure. Distilled water is non-conductive. Actually, distilled water is a wonderful insulator. So there's several industrial applications that use distilled water as an insulator rather than a conductor. However, most of the water that you run into in everyday life is not going to be distilled. It's not going to be pure water. That water contains plenty of minerals, all kinds of, not necessarily contaminants, but things that are not water. So those minerals, or electrolytes, you may have heard that term, those are what's conductive. So when you get water on a circuit board, it's going to be the minerals and electrolytes that are crystallizing and giving you this white residue that's left over. And those are also what catalyze this rust. That also has to do with the oxygen in the water. When you have oxygen reacting with metals, that forms metal oxides, and metal oxides are not good for your electronics. So as I mentioned previously, red arrow is pointing to short circuit. Pretty much anywhere you see a solder joint bridged by white minerals is going to be a short circuit. When a short circuit happens, electricity is flowing from one place to another where it is not meant to flow. So normally you want electricity flowing from one place to another, but when you have those circuits that are normally separate being connected by water, you're going to run into some problems because that's not how the circuit was designed. No circuits are designed to have water damage on them, basically. However, there are several ways to waterproof electronics where you can prevent this, which we're going to get into in a little bit. Not all of them are super practical. However, the Sur Ron, the stock model of the Sur Ron, has relatively robust waterproofing. So this is something that you might not have to worry about as someone who just bought a Sur Ron. You don't need to go spend a bunch of money to waterproof your bike. Your bike is already waterproof. So we'll talk a bit about that on the following slides. So before we really talk about the Sur Ron, we need to talk about water and conventional engines, because most of the development for waterproofing vehicles has taken place with conventional engines. However, conventional engines are much more easy to waterproof because they must maintain a certain level of pressure in order to operate, that being oil pressure. And if you can pressurize oil in a closed system, that's going to keep water out, because in order to keep the pressure in, you need to have a very well-sealed system. And inherently, a well-sealed system is going to keep water out. So the major components that you do need to take into account when you're talking about combustion engines and waterproofing them is the air intake and the exhaust. So let's talk about cars first. The air intake right here, you'll see this a lot on Jeeps. They'll have a snorkel air intake, and the snorkel air intake basically just means they're routing the air intake from under the hood up over to, usually it's the post on the side of the vehicle, and you'll have a big tube sticking out. You'll see this on like the really souped up Overlander vehicles. A lot of times you'll see them on the top model of Jeep on the showroom floor. This allows the vehicle's engine to draw air in from a higher point rather than directly under the hood. You're going to be drawing air in from closer to the top of the vehicle, and that allows you to submerge a good portion of the vehicle without having water come into the air intake, which will cause an automatic shut-off. So the other thing you have to take into consideration is the exhaust. So although the exhaust is blowing fumes out, previously combusted air out, it is also susceptible to having backflow of water into the engine, which is something that you do not want. So you need to make sure that your exhaust is also protected from the water. I'm not sure how they did it on this Jeep, but you need to make sure you're not having water flow into the exhaust into the engine, because that's going to flood your engine and you're not going to go very far. So based on my research, I couldn't find a ton of information about waterproofing dirt bikes and quads. However, there's a few videos here and there, a few articles as well about waterproofing these. It's the same concept. You need air intake and exhaust being routed up to a higher point than they were originally on the engine. So a lot of times you'll see tubes like this sticking up. This setup seems less than ideal to me, since you're going to have exhaust blowing in your face or near your face. It looks like here the exhaust would blow onto your hands most likely. So not ideal. It seems like a relatively unexplored territory, but it's something that we don't need to mess with so much. It's much more difficult to waterproof electric bikes than it is to waterproof combustion engines, because with an electric bike you need to waterproof every component rather than just the intake and exhaust. So, as far as waterproofing your Sur Ron goes, the stock Sur Ron is actually very well waterproofed in my experience. So, this last summer was a very wet summer. We had a lot of rain where I live, and I rode my Sur Ron in the rain probably a dozen times, and I never had an issue with it. Not to say I enjoy riding it in the rain, since it's pretty miserable, and you just never know when water's going to get somewhere important. So I would recommend avoiding it, but it's something that you don't need to worry about too much. And that's due to the components being just pretty much contained. Most of the wires don't have any cuts in them or openings where water could get in. So that's a big benefit to having an unmodded Sur Ron, is all of your waterproofing measures are going to be intact. So I want to talk about some things just general things that can improve your waterproofing of the bike. So one of those is going to be electrical isolation. So that means that, well, getting back to conductivity, we talked about a little bit before. Let's use this circuit board as an example. You have these pins here going across. Each solder joint is a separate circuit that needs to be isolated from the next one. If you get water between these solder joints, electricity is going to flow from one to the other, and you're going to have a short circuit and total failure of the circuit board. However, electrical isolation means that you are physically isolating those electrical circuits. So this line of pins here, not well electrically isolated because they're all right next to each other. It's very easy for water to get in between them and for electricity to flow in between them. So a better example of electrical isolation would be, say, this solder joint here and this solder joint over here. These would be separate circuits, and it's more difficult to get water in between this point and this point than it is to get water between this and this. So you're just going to decrease the likelihood that you have a short circuit. And this is something that the Sur Ron does quite well. They have these large battery terminals on the controller board, and each terminal is separated by a decent amount of space, and then there's a plastic divider between each one, and that prevents water from gathering on both terminals and short circuiting. So that's going to increase your electrical isolation, and it's something that the stock Sur Ron comes with. Another thing is physical barriers. So a lot of times you can do, like for physical barriers, you could have all of the circuit boards sealed in their own compartment away from water. However, this isn't really practical for the Sur Rons just because of the way it's designed. It doesn't leave room to seal anything up. That usually consists of like a housing and then a rubber seal around the housing. So Sur Ron does not have that. However, if you're building your own electric bike, this may be a more practical option, but it's something that you're going to have to consider from the ground up while you're designing it. And then the final option, although maybe the least practical, is a waterproof coating. So this is something that's more common in mobile phones. Is you'll have the circuit boards on the phones. They can spray them with it's usually called a micro coating that repels water, and this coating is basically hydrophobic molecules. Hydrophobic meaning it repels water, hydrophilic meaning it attracts water. So it'll be a hydrophobic coating that they spray on the circuit board, they let it dry, and then it remains there. and when any water contacts the circuit board, that coating will not allow it'll act as a barrier between the water and the electrical current flowing from one point to the next on the circuit board. So that will give you a degree of waterproofing to your raw electronics. However, my impression is it's not the best. I've never tried this, so I can't personally speak to it. And it's not very common in the e-bike community. However, you'll find some products on Amazon and eBay that claim it's do-it-yourself waterproofing, micro coating spray. But most of these products have really bad reviews, I'm assuming because they don't work all that well, and it's really not super practical for an electric bike. You could also send your circuit boards off to a company that will coat them for you, and they'll probably do a better job at it. However, this is also not so practical with the Sur Ron, since you would have to pretty much strip every single electrical component out of the bike, ship it off to a company, pay a bunch of money for them to coat it, and then have them ship it back and reinstall it. Just sounds like a headache to me. So I don't recommend this option, but if you're really serious about waterproofing, it is something that you could do feasibly. So that's going to be a case-by-case basis. So, more realistic Sur Ron waterproofing mods. Most of these mods consist of fenders that are going to physically prevent water from your tires getting kicked onto the electrical components in the bike. So, as you could imagine, if you're riding in a wet environment, water from the wheels is going to spin around the wheels and it's going to get kicked up everywhere. So pretty much every point on the wheel is going to have a jet of water spinning off of it, and you want to prevent this water from getting onto the main electrical components of your bike. So fenders are very helpful for this. As a bare minimum, I recommend this rear fender and a mud guard here and a front fender. So these are going to, like the rear fender here is going to prevent water from being kicked from the wheel directly onto your rear suspension. You do not want water or mud in your rear suspension. The mud flap will also do this very effectively. And then this fender here, I don't necessarily recommend if you plan on riding the bike off-road frequently, since riding off-road in wet conditions usually means mud, and mud tends to get caked up in between the wheel and wherever it's spinning. So you're going to have a bunch of mud building up in this fender, and it may very well lead to issues with your wheel spinning. Another thing to consider is this fender ties into the rear axle, and my understanding with the rear axle is there is just barely enough clearance for it to work as is. So when you're adding more material in here, I don't think it's a good idea, personally. It might work for you, it might work fine. I've never tried it, so I can't speak to it, but I would be hesitant to do this. And this fender here is more to prevent water from getting kicked up on your back than it is into the bike. So you can get wet and dry off. Your bike can get wet and be permanently broken. So I don't recommend this fender, but other people may, depending on their experience. I haven't tried it. Front fender, I think, is absolutely essential. I'm not sure if the Sur Ron still comes stock with a front fender or not, but it will save you, because you do not want water on this controller, you don't want water on the horn, and you just don't want water getting kicked up in your face. So just get a rear or a front fender. Rear mudguard here, as I mentioned a little bit before, absolutely essential. It prevents mud and water from getting kicked into your rear suspension. That is the fastest way to destroy your rear suspension, by getting mud in it. So this is like a $15 or $20 upgrade. It's super easy. It only takes like 4 bolts you have to take off. There's really no excuse for putting this on. You should be ordering this before you even ride your Sur Ron. It is 100% essential upgrade. Another thing you can do for water resistance is get an O-ring chain. So right here, this looks like a non-O-ring chain to me. And non-O-ring chains, they work fine, but they're going to rust more easily, and you're going to have to oil them more frequently. So if you're riding in wet environments a lot, I suggest going with an O-ring chain, since they seal out a lot of the mud and water, as well as self-lubricating. And that pretty much means your chain is going to last longer. However, O-ring chains offer more friction on your drivetrain, so that's going to certainly decrease your range per charge and your top speed. So that's something to consider if you want to switch over to an O-ring chain. They're a lot more robust, they're a lot better for wet climates. However, you're going to sacrifice some of your power. Another thing is heat shrink. If you do any kind of aftermarket mods that require cutting wires, you're going to need to heat shrink those. So for my Sur Ron, I had to extend this rear light because I put seat extenders on. The wire was no longer long enough to reach all the way back, so I had to cut the wire and add more. And I heat shrinked that about 3 times just to prevent water from getting in. Heat shrink is not going to make it waterproof, but it will prevent splashes from directly contacting your wire. So, Sur Ron performance in the rain and snow. I showed this image in my last video. It is a commercial snowmobile kit for the Sur Ron, which I did not know existed, and I'm honestly quite impressed with. You got your tread on the back and then a ski on the front. So I haven't tested this, and I don't intend to, but it's a pretty cool upgrade in my book. It'll run you about $1,300, but if you're in a place that gets snow, 6 months out of the year, I think this would be well worth it. So just something to consider. This will certainly drastically improve your handling in the snow. And now I'm going to show a video of my ride home from work with a little bit of snow on the ground. It's not too crazy, but I just want to showcase a little bit of how the Sur Ron performs. So now that you've seen that, let's talk about handling in the snow. On a base level, anything with 2 wheels in the snow is going to have very poor handling compared to 4 wheels. So this is a matter of physics, nothing else, just because if you're on 2 wheels, you are relying on balance to keep you upright. And when you're in wet conditions, you're going to run into more issues with balance, because the second that your tires lose grip on the surface that they're riding on, you're going to start sliding and you're going to end up in a ditch somewhere. So you really need to be careful riding any 2-wheeled vehicle in the snow or rain, just because your traction is going to be much worse, and you don't benefit from having 4-wheel stability. A car, it cannot tip over on its own because of those 4 wheels, but a bike certainly can. So an upgrade that a lot of people will do for riding in the snow is studded tires. This is more for when you're riding on ice or densely packed snow. If you're riding with studded tires on the street or on dirt, they're going to wear out extremely quickly, and it's going to cause you more problems than it's worth. So I would recommend not going with this option unless you're sort of in the same market as somebody looking for the electric snow bike setup. I would think the snow bike would be much better performing in the snow than studded tires would be, but it's an option. It's really very specific for riding on ice, but you could do this. There's a lot of methods for DIY studded tires, so you can look at more into that if you're interested. And in my experience, the Sur Ron is quite good in the snow. I mean, you can't really get around the handling and traction issues that you run into on any two-wheeled vehicle, whether it be motorcycle, mountain bike, or electric bike. But I haven't had any issues with waterproofing or anything like that. Your handling will be worse, but that's something that, I mean, even cars handle worse in the snow. Another thing I've noticed is squealing brakes in the snow and just wet conditions. So the stock Sur Ron brakes are honestly quite terrible, and they squeal extremely loud even if they get a little bit wet. I've upgraded to some Shimano brakes on my rear on the rear of my Sur Ron, and those work much better in wet conditions. However, I have noticed that they do squeal a little bit sometimes. They don't squeal nearly as much as the stock Sur Ron brakes, but they do squeal. And your brakes are going to function less effectively in any wet conditions versus dry conditions. So that's something to take into account. If you are riding your Sur Ron in wet conditions, I would highly recommend upgrading to Shimano brakes. And I'm going to show a video right here of my brakes squealing. The squeal you hear is mostly the front brake, the stock Sur Ron brakes, but there is a little bit of squeal from the Shimano brakes on the back as well. So I would like to thank everybody for watching my video. As I said at the beginning, I really appreciate the continued support and just nothing but kind comments. So please like my video and subscribe, and then I just ask that you comment as many times as possible. So I really appreciate everybody coming out and watching, and I've just been blown away by the support on YouTube. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much, and have a phenomenal day.